I was in college at the time that this happened. I was 18, on my own for the first time, and not really sure of what I was doing. I had some friends from high school attending the same college, plus I was making some new friends, which was cool and fairly easy for me to do. The majority of the people I was meeting were actually nice and willing to talk to me instead of blowing me off because I didn't fit their standards. The first month of school was pretty neat, learning new things, taking new classes. Honestly, it was great because things were seemingly going smooth despite how nervous I was about being there. I have always been a shy person. Making friends came easily and naturally to me, but there was the awkwardness of me not being able to make small talk. I could hold a conversation for maybe 3 to 5 minutes maximum, so aside from hanging around kids I went to high school with and the newer friends that I had made during my first few weeks there, I spent as much time alone as I possibly could. I had started smoking at the age of 15, and going off to college didn't change that. The only real problem I had, and this was after finding out during my orientation, was the fact that we could smoke, but we were not allowed to do so on campus property, which left me in a small predicament. I had to find a place to smoke. I walked throughout the small college town during my second week, and found a few spots that I could smoke in. One day, I had run out of cigarettes, and my friend was in class at the time. We were supposed to meet up at the cafeteria after her class was over, but I couldn't wait 2 hours for a cigarette. I left my dorm room, making sure I had my keys with me, before heading up the small driveway between the dormitory buildings and to the gas station across the street. I waited in line for 5 minutes before I was able to buy my cigarettes. Once I had them in my hand and the change in my pocket, I was out the front door. I lit a cigarette, inhaling that sweet taste of menthol before heading down the street to the right of the building. I was texting my elder sister to let her know how school was going so far while walking down the street. I started my way back toward campus when I lit my second cigarette. My sister had to go to work, so I was left with no one to talk to. I shoved my cell phone into my pocket and stared at the ground as I walked closer toward the back side of the gas station when I heard someone talking. I looked up to see a kid my age sitting on a wooden log behind the gas station. He had a skateboard underneath his left foot while he took a drag of his own cigarette. I hadn't seen him around the campus before, but given the backpack beside his right leg, I assumed he was a college student. He asked me a couple of questions. I think it was to the extent of if I went to school there and what year I was in. I answered him, and he invited me to sit down. I was hesitant because, as I previously stated, I was shy and couldn't make small talk, but I sat down anyway. He introduced himself. For the sake of privacy, we'll call him Jared. I introduced myself and chatted a bit with the guy. We had quite a bit of things in common, and I thought he was pretty cool. A while had passed by, and I was still engaged in conversation, but I looked down at my phone and realized that I had to go because it was time for lunch. I stood up from the wooden log, grabbed my cigarettes, lighter, and phone before telling him that I had to go. He offered to walk me to the cafeteria since he was headed back to his dorm, which happened to be on the way. He walked me to the cafeteria, we said our goodbyes, and went our separate ways. I had lunch with my friend, headed back to the dorm so I could get my backpack, and headed to my afternoon classes. I was relieved to be in the same class as my roommate, and another class with my friend. I wasn't alone in those classes, so that was something. Once my classes were over, my friend and I headed back to the dorm where we dropped off our backpacks. We started working on our homework assignments, but I needed a cigarette, so I went back to the spot behind the gas station since it was the closest place to campus that I could find as my designated smoking area. I was on my second cigarette when the guy from earlier came sauntering down the street with a smirk on his face. He joined me on the wooden log and engaged me in another conversation. We sat there until the sun began to set, and he walked me back to my dormitory because it wasn't far from his. Once we were back at my dorm, he went to say goodnight, but my roommates practically dragged him into our dorm and began to bombard him with questions. 2 of my roommates were fun to be around, however, one of them flirted with any guy that she possibly could. He was no different, yet he brushed her comments off, glancing at me with every opportunity he was presented. He stuck around the dorm, entertaining my roommates by telling them things about himself, while I sat at the small kitchen table and did my homework. My roommates finally let him leave around 11 o'clock that night, He told me good night and that he'd see me around. I thought he was pretty cool, even if I hadn't really paid much attention to what he had told my roommates. Jared and I bumped into each other around campus periodically throughout the remainder of that month, and by the time September rolled around, seeing him had become a regular thing. He started to sit with my friend and I at lunch, and I didn't think anything of it. At the time, I had a crush on one of my classmates from high school. We'll call him Colby, and I'd liked him since the 3rd grade. My focus was on catching the attention of Colby without realizing that I had caught the attention of Jared and a few other guys on campus. There was one particular night during the middle of September. I was having a rough night because one of my roommates had stolen a necklace that meant a lot to me. After campus security and the police had taken the statements of my side of things and the roommate that stole the necklace, I had left the dormitory and was on the way to my smoking area behind the gas station when Jared ran up beside me. He asked me what happened since he had seen the police lights and heard campus security talking on their walkies about something pertaining to my dormitory building. I told him that I didn't really want to talk about it. He said that was fine, but he was going to tag along with me because it was 10 o'clock at night and he didn't trust the people who ran around the campus at that time. I brushed him off because I was upset about my necklace. We walked off campus property, down the street beside the gas station, until he pulled me down on the darn wooden log beside him. Jared attempted once more to ask me what had happened, and all I told him was that my roommate and I had gotten into an argument, which is why I had to leave the dorm for a little while. We sat on that log in silence for at least 10 minutes. I was staring at the ground and smoking my cigarette. Jared said something causing me to look at him because I hadn't heard what he said, and he leaned in and kissed me. I was really stunned, absolutely shocked that he had kissed me unexpectedly like that. He told me he liked me and asked if I'd go out with him. I was in the middle of processing what happened and all I could do was nod my head. He hugged me and then proceeded to walk me back to my dorm. I nodded my head when he told me good night, unlocked the door to my dorm, shut it, and locked it behind me, all the while still wondering what in the holy heck had just happened. I texted him an hour later and apologized for agreeing to go out with him when I just didn't feel that way about him. Jared seemed to take the news pretty well, but continued to hang around me a lot. I was cool being friends with him. He wasn't a bad person, and eventually I had met all his roommates, who were insistent on me dating him, to which I continuously denied. Eventually, one of his roommates decided that it would be fun to try and force a kiss on me while Jared was around. I think it was his way of seeing if I would like the act of Jared rescuing me from a potentially dangerous situation, but Jared had never gotten the chance because I punched the kid in the face and kneed him in the groin. I wasn't stupid. Anyway, Jared apologized for his roommate acting like a jerk and walked me back to my dorm. It was Friday, so I told Jared to have a good weekend and gave him the phone number of the friend that I was going to be spending the weekend with back home. The truth of the matter was, the phone number was from one of those texting apps like WhatsApp or Text Now. The account I made was for me to see what Jared would say about me. I didn't tolerate any crap, and he did nothing but complain about him not being good enough, how he didn't understand why I didn't like him, and if I had ever talked about him. I didn't feel bad at the time for pretending to be a friend and telling him to just give her time and she'll come around. Jared avoided me for a while after that, and then one day he was suddenly gone. My friend and I had met 2 guys which we later found out were brothers. I started dating the older brother while my friend dated the brother that was our age. My boyfriend at that time, let's call him Trey, was sweet and kind. We were together for about a month and a half when Jared suddenly reappeared at school, but something about him was off. Jared was acting completely different, incredibly angry and jealous about the fact that I had a boyfriend, and yet he still pretended that we were friends after I told him to leave me alone. Jared was desperate to not be innocent anymore, and thought that I would be the person to help him get rid of that title. When I refused and told him to never speak to me again, he was beyond mad. He continued to follow me around campus, text me and call me in the middle of the night to see if I wanted to have a cigarette with him, but he failed at trying to get me to talk to him. I ended up leaving college in December, and Jared continued to message me. He figured out what town I was from and eventually decided to try and follow me home. I threatened to make a call to the police, and he finally backed off. 2 entire years went by with him still messaging me on Facebook and being civil, and he ended up apologizing about his behavior. He also said that he wished I had gone back to school for the second semester, and that's when I blocked him on everything. It took me 2 years to get him to leave me alone. It was bad enough that he had to act that way while I was dealing with a stalker. I seriously think that Jared is still out there somewhere, trying to figure out how to get a hold of me, and honestly, the thought alone still scares me.
This story took place back when I was in college. I had a lot of friends that liked to party, and while I wasn't the type that liked to drink or do stupid things, I was the type to make sure my friends got to and from the party responsibly. Basically, I was their designated driver. I would drive them to the parties, sit around and drink soda until they were drunk off of their butts, then drive them back home. It may sound like an incredibly boring way to spend your college years, but I honestly had a lot of fun with it. I'm not an incredibly social person myself, so just kind of sitting around and watching people make themselves look like idiots was my idea of a fun Friday night. This situation occurred at one party that was particularly rowdy and had a lot of people I didn't know, which usually happened when the parties were off campus. I was there and sitting in the corner with my Dr. Pepper and talking with another girl that was completely trashed. She and I were having a conversation about my education, something that she seemed way more interested in than she should have been, when one of my friends comes over to me and asks if I can take one of his friends home, and was insistent that it was just down the street. I usually don't play DD with people that I don't personally know, but I also didn't want this guy struggling to get home if he needed the ride. I reluctantly agreed and said that as long as my friend was vouching for him and that it wasn't too far from the party, I would take him home. I got up and followed him out to the front door, and he shouted to some guy named Greg, telling him that I would take him home. They said their drunken goodbyes, and I walked over to my car, which I should add was a late 90s Dodge Caravan. After they were done talking and telling each other how much they would miss each other, Greg walked over and smiled at me, asking if this was the car. I told him that this was the one and got in the driver's seat. He, for some reason, opened the sliding door and hopped into one of the back seats. I was curious, but if there's one thing you don't ask a drunk person you are taking home, it's why they choose to do mundane things. He gets buckled in and I pull onto the road, and then ask him where he's headed. He tells me an address that's about 5 blocks down the way, literally a straight shot and only a few minutes away. As drunken people often do, he starts rambling about random things. He tells me that his name was Gregory, and that he was named after his grandfather. He tells me about a dog he used to have as a child named Bucky, and how much he missed him. He then tells me about his sister and how she runs a beauty salon in New Mexico, and how he and his mother never really got along. This guy is seriously telling me his life story within the span of 1.5 miles. I pull up to where he wanted to go and let him know that we are at his house, just in case he didn't realize it. And he just kind of sits there and stares at nothing. After a few seconds of really awkward silence, he literally starts to cry. Out of nowhere, he tells me that he's sorry. I have no idea why he's sorry, and I tell him that he doesn't need to be. After sobbing for a few moments, he tells me that I was the nicest person he'd met, and that he was going to miss all this. Once again, I'm just sitting here silently, and he's telling me how much he's going to miss everything out here. Then he tells me why he's going to miss it. He drops in with, "I'm about to go to prison for a really long time." I just kind of sat there and nodded. He, of course, continues. "I made a mistake and accidentally assaulted my ex-girlfriend, so I have to go to court tomorrow and I'm going to go away for a long time." As he finished telling me about what he did to her, he starts to chuckle and stare at me in the rearview mirror. He smiles and tells me that I kind of remind him of his ex and that he hated her. After a few more moments, he shrugs and tells me that he appreciated the ride and that we should go get lunch when he gets out of prison. I just agreed and nodded along until he got out and got to his door. As soon as he entered his house, I let out a huge sigh of relief. The entire time he was staring at me and telling me about what he'd done, I felt like I was holding my breath. This was the last time that I gave anyone a ride that wasn't one of my immediate friends, and I hope I literally never meet Gregory ever again.
Do you want to hear the most terrifying experience ever? I'll tell you one of the worst experiences that I've ever had, and it all goes back to when I was 17. For clarification, I started smoking at the age of 15. Now, at that age, it was tough to acquire a cigarette, let alone smoke one, so a few months before my 18th birthday, I began going on walks at midnight in order to smoke without being caught. Plus, I could actually take the time to enjoy the taste of tobacco instead of just sucking it down as fast as possible. The neighborhood that I lived in at the time wasn't particularly the best, but there was something about walking around the block, listening to music, messaging the friends that I had met online and the ones in real life, while smoking when I wasn't supposed to be, that was thrilling. It was a real rush of adrenaline. My nightly ritual was fun for the first few weeks, until I got the sense that someone was watching me. I'll admit, I was scared when the feeling of being watched first washed over me. I carried a pocket knife with me, so it wasn't like I couldn't defend myself if need be. It was more or less the fact that I would have to potentially stab someone if they were to try and attack me, which is why I asked my younger brother to start walking with me. My brother was only 1 year younger than myself, and putting the two of us together was a dangerous combination, because we grew up fighting each other and the neighborhood kids. My brother and I did the nightly walk for another 2 months. Then, when February came, the feeling of being watched intensified, and this time, I wasn't the only one who felt it. There was one particular night, about 5 days before my birthday, when my brother and I were walking. We were halfway around the block when someone whistled. We stopped dead in our tracks and slowly looked at each other. My brother nodded, and we took off 90-0 back to our house, ran inside, and locked the door behind us. We went to my room and told my younger sister what happened. We shut the bedroom light off and used the light of our phone screens to see each other. The three of us talked for about 30 to 35 minutes when we decided to go to the kitchen and get a drink. We had just walked in front of the door when the handle started to slightly jiggle. The three of us stopped, listening to the door handle as well as the clock on the wall ticking. The handle started jiggling more furiously, which caused us to cautiously kneel down and slowly crawl back through the house and into my room, where we all fell asleep on the floor. The next morning, our grandmother told us about how a neighbor's house was broken into and the woman was assaulted. We sure as heck were relieved that we had a deadbolt on the front door and a gun inside the house in case the robber had broken into our house. Suffice it to say, I never want to be in that situation again, despite being much older now.
It never fails to amaze me how brave some people are in public, especially towards other people, such as myself. I started working at Walmart a few years out of high school, so barely 21. I definitely ran into some jerks before, but the creepy old guys were the kicker. What's worse is how they didn't seem to care who else was around to witness this. I started working in the fitting rooms, and we saw plenty of people attempt to do inappropriate things in it. Those are stories for another day. I eventually transferred to customer service because I was tired of being the one to call maintenance in the fitting rooms. Before Walmart had the specific money center service, we did it at customer service, so money orders, money transfers, and even some utility payments. We started getting this one guy that just looked slimy as heck. He always wore jeans and a nasty tank top. His hair was really long and stringy, like he washed it twice a year but usually pulled it back into a ponytail. He would hit on all of the younger girls and treat the older ones like dirt if he couldn't just avoid them. He started coming up to customer service to be rang up when the lines were long because he learned we won't turn people down. When it was just me there, he'd always be leaning over the counter, smirking, and he'd always call me babe, which alone was creepy and made me feel gross. Unfortunately, he had more reason to go to customer service because he started doing money transfers too. Those started becoming real suspicious too, and he could tell I was onto him. They were always even amounts, always under the amount that we had to report, and he always made it out to people and the names were never the same. I tried to play dumb once since he had sent well over 10 grand within a week, and I acted concerned for him, saying, "Do you know the people you're sending money to?" and mentioned how there had been a lot of scammers. He smirked and said, "Yeah, they're my employees. This is the fastest way I can pay them." I thought, not really, but hey, it was none of my business, so I dropped it for now. However, he continued coming in and continued to be a creep, and I was getting fed up with it. I mentioned it to someone that worked there about how the money transfers were really sus, but she just shrugged it off. The problem with at least the store I worked at was that nobody seemed to care. If it didn't directly affect them, they didn't bother with anything. So I figured out how to file a report myself on the money transfers and did. In the meantime, he continued to show up there. However, things got worse. We all wore name tags so he could see our first name, but not our last. Yet, one time he came in to do another money transfer. He started handing me the paper. He took his sunglasses off and said, "Let's do this without the small talk today, Miss Anderson." How in the heck did he know my last name? I just stared at him for a second before continuing. It was obvious at this point to him that he was correct. I completed it without another word to him and continued on with my day. I again told my coworker when they came in and said he probably just saw it somewhere or overheard someone else say it. I didn't believe this because I had no reason to use my last name but could do nothing about it. From then on, he would come in and make more gross comments to me, call me babe, and make kissing faces even at me. At one point, I was already having a bad day when I saw him in line, so I called up my manager and told them that they need to bring him up because I was no longer comfortable doing it. Their idea of doing that was to look over the form, check his ID, and then hand it to me saying, "Do it." Furiously, I did so as he leaned against the counter and chuckled. He then said that I was too smart and pretty to be working here and that he could get me a good paying job with my looks. I looked him straight in the eyes and said no thanks and didn't say another word to him. That night, as I was walking to my car to leave, I noticed an envelope on my windshield. As stupid as it was, I looked around, got in my car, and opened it. It was a card saying happy birthday with a hotel card in it with a room number written on it. The card said something else, like, "In case you change your mind." The part that freaked me out the most was that my birthday was tomorrow. Granted, I had no proof, but I knew it had to be this guy. Not only did he know my full name, but he also knew what I drove and my birthday. I started crying in my car. I lived alone, so I had no one to turn to or talk to about this other than my mom. She suggested I call the police, but I had no evidence it was even this guy, and besides, he hasn't done anything specifically to me, so I know they won't do much. I did start having this guy that did cards walk me to my car just in case. He was one of the few people there that I liked and believed me. I quit shortly after and started working with my mom because I didn't want to see this guy anymore. I hope he got caught because I never want to see him again, and I hope he didn't put anyone else through this.
What's up, everybody? This is the Lone Wolf here. Thank you so much for listening to the video. I hope you guys enjoyed the stories. I want to give a huge thank you to Beautiful Nightmare for not only supplying me with the stories you just heard, but also for teaming up with me in this video. There will be a link to her channel in the description below, as well as an icon that will appear at the end of this video, so please feel free to check her out and show her some love. Anyways, if you're new to my channel, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing if you enjoyed the narrations. Hit that bell for notifications and join the Lone Wolf Pack. If you guys want to send me a message or maybe a personal scary story that you want me to read, there will be a link to my email and my Twitter account in the description below. There will also be links in the description for the music artists that I used in this video, as well as the individual tracks that I used in case you're interested in the music. And last but not least, if any of you guys have any ideas or tips for me to make my channel better, please leave me a comment or send me a personal message. Until next time, stay spooky. And remember, the hunt begins when the moon is full. Sleep tight.